Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and I'm joined by Lisa, who is having a time of it this morning. Would you say that's an accurate description?
I'm having a time of it this morning, and it's really funny. It's a real contrast because yesterday I really tried with my Sunday to take it easy, not just, I don't know. I was trying to really have a relaxing day. And then it just turned into one of those Monday mornings that felt like it undid all of the relaxation I worked so hard to do on Sunday. But so it goes.
Yes, so it goes. That is one of the things I think about that a lot lately. I feel like we've even talked about this a little in other ways on the podcast where it's you always think you're going to get to this place, I've achieved my Zen zone and I'm going to stay in. And it's no, you're not. No. You're going to stay there for as long as you can. And then you're going to be back out of it. And that's just kind of the hamster wheel that we're on, and it's people think, oh, I'm going to get to this place where I'm feeling at total peace or I'm happy. And it's well, yeah, but also life is full of ups and downs. And so it's about kind of trying to find, I don't know, that balance within it all when we can, I guess.
Yeah. My mom used to have this print in her kitchen that said, "The only constant is change." And I was oh, yeah, I think of it often when I'm oh, right, no state will stay with us forever. Not the worst ones and not the best ones. You just have to go with it.
I feel as I age, I think about that a lot too, just in terms of just how things change over the years. How we listen to music, right? When we were young, I still had records. Yep. But it was mostly cassette tapes. And then by the time we were teenagers, it was CDs. And then it was, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the where you ripped off the MP3s.
MP3s, yeah, Napster.
Napster, that's what I was looking for. And then it's, Spotify and Apple Music and things like that. And it's you always just think this is how it is. This is how it's always going to be. And then it changes and it evolves. I was thinking about that a lot with our website, which has gone through so much change just because the internet has changed so drastically from when we started. When we started, we just wrote blogs because blogs were something that people wanted and liked and they subscribed to the blog, and you could share your little blog on Facebook and organically get a lot of people reading it. And now I don't know, how many people listening to this are aware of how much kind of the internet has changed, but with AI and things like that, Google has made so many changes that that's just not how people consume the internet anymore. And so we're having to totally rethink how we connect and communicate with people. And it's just funny because you just really think it's always going to be that way.
I know.
And then it changes.
I have such a nostalgia for blogs. I miss other people's blogs. I just miss that era of the internet. So I really have a deep nostalgia. And I think I think about it so much because everything has become so bite-sized. Everything is so just small on Instagram and TikTok and, how quickly things are fed to you. And I just really loved kind of the long form nature of blogs where you really felt I don't know. It was just a whole different era of the internet.
I agree. I miss that a lot too. And I worry because I feel my attention span is drastically reduced. And I'm is this a function of my age or is this a function of just how we interact with information these days? I don't have such a tolerance for sitting down and reading something long. And I'm did I ever? But yeah, I guess I had to have, right? used to read research papers and books and all sorts of things. Now I feel like my tolerance is so low, or my attention span at least. So yeah, it's interesting. With technology, I feel like things move so rapidly now.
Yeah.
Things change so rapidly. Like, 1 minute you think that this is the thing, this is the way we're going to consume this media, or this is the way we're going to interact with people and whatever. And then the next minute that thing is done with and you're on to the next. It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, I was thinking recently, my dad died at the end of my freshman year in college, and I was listening to something that was just talking about the demise of the handwritten letter, and how with email, like, people just stopped sending people handwritten letters in the mail. And obviously email existed when I say obviously, it hadn't existed that long when I was a freshman in college, but my dad sent me letters my freshman year in college, like actual physical letters. And I was thinking how I'm so grateful. Like, there are many things I'm sad about because my dad died before, really even before, like, really the surge of cell phones, but certainly not, like, I don't have any, like, video or camera. I think about so many people now when they lose someone and they have so many photos and videos and voicemails and like all of that. And my dad died before that was really a thing. So I have so little of that, but I'm so grateful that I have these handwritten letters that my dad sent me that, I think a lot of people aren't lucky to have. Not that emails that people send you aren't also meaningful, but there's something about it being in his handwriting. Like, it's just nice to have them.
Yeah, I agree with that. My mom used to write letters, especially if she was like worried about you for some reason. Like, she would write like 5 pages back and front, crammed, just trying to like give advice or help. Or she went out to Barnes and Noble and sat there and like researched whatever your problem was and like put all of it into a letter and sent it to you. And I feel like those things, I don't know, like, some people do write thoughtful emails like that. Like, my dad writes emails that are like long and thoughtful, but like most people don't. I think we rely on other forms of communication. And I like that permanent. It feels a little more permanent. Granted, you can lose a letter, right? You can really easily lose it. But like, I feel like with technology, relying on technology, I've lost so much stuff because a phone has died or a computer went on the fritz and things like that. It's like, it feels so impermanent. It's just kind of, and maybe that's just me not making the shift to this kind of like more technology mindset of needing to like preserve things there.
Back everything up on the cloud.
But I don't know. Anyways,
I
don't even know how we got to talking about this, but the idea that change is the one constant. So,
well, and I've been trying to, Jennifer just said in the chat, like, I've been thinking about I've been trying hard to slow down. And Jennifer just said, I don't think our brains are designed for this speed of change. And I don't think they're designed for this speed of consumption, of just so much consumption. I've been trying to make this really conscious effort of limiting some of my online consumption, which is funny since obviously we are an online grief support space, but outside of What's Your Grief, I've been really trying to make efforts about that because I do feel like it just takes me away from things that feel more engaging and present in the world. And I've been trying to feel a little bit more grounded in like physical objects and not things that are on screens, but like writing letters, writing cards, making things like that. It is one of the reasons I really like art and creativity, even though it comes in fits and starts for me, is that it feels very physical.
I agree with you. I have said this before on the podcast. I absolutely hate my phone. I despise my phone. I think it's ruined my life, but I can't detach myself from it. And so I totally agree with you. And I do see like a lot of benefit, right? And being able to stay connected to people. Just this morning, I was driving and I was thinking like, when we first started What's Your Grief, the internet was not a good place for grief support. Like, the stuff out there was bad. It was bad. And that's not everybody. There were a few bright spots, but there was a lot of stuff that was like not correct, like misinformation, really out of date, just like not accessible. And I was thinking to myself, and I was like, I can't really remember the last time I saw something that I was like, "Oh no," online for grief
For
support.
grief. I agree.
And probably owing to the fact that we can like spread ideas and communicate and kind of borrow, quote unquote, borrow. There's some stealing going on, but whatever. But because we can connect and share and learn from other people, I do feel like we've really moved the needle on the information out there with grief support. Now I still think it's pretty niche, and if you're not grieving, you're not always paying attention to it, so those misconceptions and myths, they still are quite pervasive. But I do think that once you get here, I don't know I was going to say it's not a terrible place to be. I don't know. Like, it's not incorrect.
Yeah. No, it's not incorrect. And I think not incorrect with one, with a few exceptions.
Yes,
but
of course.
Yeah, I do think I just wrote an article about that went out in the newsletter was about the one downside, and somebody even wrote a comment about this on the article, was that their consumption of grief media had sort of intensified their idea that grief is supposed to have this like transformational arc, and like they're supposed to have like some sort of grand revelation or meaning making or something. And their comment sort of implied like, until I ended up consuming a lot of grief content, I didn't necessarily feel that, but the consumption increased that, which that is the one thing I do really understand, because I do think that unfortunately there is a little bit of a feeling of like, like some of the people who are out there like telling their stories in wonderful ways, the reason they feel like they're in a place to tell their story or want to tell it is because they did have a transformational arc. And then you start to think like that's how it is supposed to be, which this isn't directly related, but I think it's a little bit connected to what we wanted to talk about today. Like we have a question that we want to answer from a listener submitted question from our community that I think connects to this idea that when we start watching what everybody else is doing in grief, or like what the recommendations are, or what you do see in the support space, then you might start to question yourself a little bit or have questions about what you should be doing.
Yeah. I'll share the question, actually. This came in, like you said, in our community, we have a space where you can, quote unquote, ask a grief expert. And we try and answer them in a lot of different formats, but one of the formats is here on the podcast. So I'm going to read the question. It's going to be de-identified. And we then we have some specific thoughts about this question in particular, but then also just kind of related to some of the ideas that are related to this. So the question is, I've journaled for decades and always found it helpful until it came to a grinding halt a few months ago. I experienced some dark, griefy times and didn't feel like replaying them by writing in my journal. I haven't journaled in 3 to 4 months, and I haven't missed it. I feel like I'm moving forward through being in the community and listening to recordings and other types of support. And the question is it necessary to journal as a part of the grief journey? I'm doing okay without it, and I feel like I'll return to it when I'm ready. I just want to make sure that I'm not in denial. So the question is basically like, the way I'm reading it and interpreting it is it okay to not use this outlet that I've used for many, many years in the midst of my grief? And could that be a sign that I don't want to use this outlet? Maybe that I don't want to visit some things in this context of journaling. Is that a sign that I'm in, quote unquote, denial, or a word that we use a lot related to denial, not exactly the same, but avoidance, maybe. Am I avoiding? So yeah, what are your initial thoughts when I read that question, Lisa?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting, it felt like a layered question to me, because I think there is the experience of just knowing that there has been an outlet for you or a type of coping that had been helpful in your life, and suddenly not finding it helpful in grief or feeling distanced and detached from it. And I think even when we remove journaling from it and just think about that in an abstract way, I think that is an experience that can be unsettling for people when they're like, wait, what is going on? This thing that always helped me doesn't feel helpful anymore. So I think there's that layer. But then I was struck that there's this second layer, which is that in this case, it happens to be journaling. And I think journaling is one of those go-to coping tools that you just see all the time. People are like, you need to journal, start a journal. Here's, journaling prompts. Journaling was so helpful for me. And so I think that there may be an added layer of questioning that comes with this one particularly, because there's feeling the disconnection and then also seeing it everywhere, including our hub where we have a journaling course and journaling prompts and do community writing, that reinforces this idea that journaling is really helpful. So there might be more questioning, because it feels like this is one of those prescribed things for grief. So I guess, those as two separate things, really separate but related things, really jumped out to me when I heard the question.
Yeah. So the question of, is this denial? When I read the question, my instinct is to say, I don't see it as being denial, because the person shared that they have other outlets for coping with grief. And so it could be that there are certain things you're not ready to face. And it could be that there's certain places you're not ready to go. But I do think if you are exploring other outlets and finding other ways to maybe explore your experiences, find coping, that is a sign to me that it's not denial. It could be that journaling has been an accessible place for you, right? Because it allowed you to explore your experiences similar to this, but on a different scale, right? And grief can be such a big thing that sometimes it's easier to find like little baby steps to chip away at certain experiences and to kind of dip your toe into exploring certain memories and thoughts and things like that. And it's okay if you're not like opening the floodgates and letting it all in all at once, in my opinion. I think when we get into an area where there are certain places that we are just all out, not willing to go, and that's something that's kind of maybe bothering us or getting in the way of us finding any sort of peace or healing, or getting in the way of our like daily functioning. Maybe it's like we're avoiding people, places, and things like in real life. When we start to avoid things in a way that really gets in the way, then that's something we might want to kind of explore. But if you're finding that you still have ways to cope at a pace that feels comfortable and you're making strides, then I think that just means that, right now this journaling piece is not right for you, and other things might be a better fit for what you're wanting, feeling, thinking.
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think the other thing I would add to it is that with journaling, and there was something about the question that sort of made me feel like this might have been a small part of it, is sometimes there is a feeling of a little bit of rumination that can come with journaling, where it feels like I'm just going over the same things again, or coming back to the same pain points or the same emotions or challenges. And they've actually done some research that has shown that as helpful as journaling can be in so many situations, that in grief, it can sometimes fall into that rumination place that doesn't feel useful for people, where they feel like, oh, this type of journaling isn't giving me the same thing that journaling gave me before my loss. And sometimes that can be an indication that, oh, journaling's not the right fit right now. And like you said, that's completely okay. It doesn't sound like this person is avoiding in other ways or in denial. It can also be that sometimes another type of journaling could be helpful, doing something more structured and with prompts, doing something that maybe isn't necessarily as much about revisiting things that are especially painful if that's feeling hard, and instead journaling maybe about future facing things or other types of gratitude journaling or things that might connect to your grief but be different. That sometimes can feel different, or it can give a different type of experience than just free form journaling. So, I think it's oftentimes important to remember that you can play around with it if you really do feel called to sit down and try journaling again.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. In the question it said I'm okay with taking this break. But like you mentioned before, one thing that stands out about this question, and that we see a lot with other people in grief, is that a coping tool that previously felt really comfortable, that was really useful, that was really utilized quite frequently, all of a sudden is not accessible anymore. And for a lot of people, that is very disorienting because that was their go-to. That was their thing. For some people, it might have also been something that felt like a passion in a way. Like a lot of times people feel very disconnected from places of passion, like maybe if it was a creative outlet that you used to use, things like that. Journaling, of course, can fall under creative, right? But it could also be art or photography or making music, things like that. All of a sudden, you may feel really disconnected from this thing. So it may first and foremost be like a loss of that coping outlet, but it could also be kind of a loss of something that previously felt therapeutic or made you feel really good. And that can be very disorienting. It can be a secondary loss for a lot of people. And so one of the suggestions I would offer, and we can discuss others if we have them, is what you said, is maybe before the way you were using it doesn't work now in this context, and you need to look at a different way to kind of approach it. And with journaling, of course, it's like, oh, if you were a free writer, maybe now it's more about doing more directive, like responding to prompts or having a very specific kind of topic, or maybe being a little more just like like writing down the events of the day, things like that to get you started. But trying to think about how else might I access this in a way that feels not overwhelming, if the issue is worrying about opening up the door to all those experiences and emotions at once, or maybe it's just that you feel meh, you feel very dull. And how can I work towards getting back to feelings towards this outlet?
Yeah, I think the other piece to remember, coming maybe from that place of, I don't know, just like self-compassion and not feeling overwhelmed by the sense of secondary loss, is that sometimes these are things that we've really connected to our identity. I think there are some people who maybe they practice yoga, or they're runners, or they're, again, artists or writers or whatever it is, but that it's something that really has been a huge part of your life. And suddenly now in grief, you feel disconnected from it. And it's like, wow, this is like a piece of myself that feels gone. And there can be some self-judgment of, why can't I connect with this? What does this mean? I think it can be important to remember this isn't all or nothing. Like oftentimes we do ebb and flow. As I said earlier, with my relationship, sometimes with creativity, it ebbs and it flows. And sometimes we have periods where we're deeply connected, and we have other periods where we fall further away from things, and we may reconnect again, we may not, but that isn't something we need to necessarily be self-critical about, but it's just the nature of usually the relationship that we have with the things that we engage with. And that you can use some of those ideas that you mentioned with and that we talked about with journaling specifically, I think in other areas. it can sometimes be that we can't engage with what we were doing before. Maybe our yoga practice no longer feels like it is working. Maybe that was always a place that you could get in a meditative state, and now you feel like you can't. And so you're comparing yourself to what it used to be like, and it's not working anymore. So maybe it is exploring other physical outlets, exploring different types of meditation, exploring, dance or hiking or cycling or something else to just see and test the waters. And sometimes in grief, it can be hard to try and test new things, but sometimes it can also be really good. It stimulates our brain when we try new things, engage with new things. That can be something that releases feel-good chemicals in our brain. It can be rewarding and stimulating for us. So sometimes there can be real value in pushing ourselves to explore new outlets if the same old outlets aren't working for us.
Yeah. We've said it before and we'll say it a million times, like, be careful not to always compare yourself to the person who you were pre-loss, because that person was different, and I think we do this all the time, not just with this. Actually, that idea comes from CBT, because people do that all the time, cognitive behavioral therapy, and behavioral activation. This idea that we shouldn't compare ourselves to who we were before necessarily, especially when we've gone through something tough or when we're getting started at something. And quite often we'll really be unrealistic. Like, sometimes I think to myself, like, I need to start exercising again. And I'll be like, but I can't, exercise like I did when I was 20. Like, I don't have the time, whatever. But, and I'm like, well, why would, like, I'm not 20 anymore. It's crazy that I'm comparing myself to my standard of who I was when I was 20. And when you have those ideas that it has to be this, that's when you get really frustrated and overwhelmed and don't even do anything, because you're like, well, if I can't be that, then it's not worth doing. And so, yeah, we just need to be really careful about the points of comparison that we are bringing in. And like you said, like, our identity, it can be a part of our identity. And I do think that, when we do think about it, like, oh, before I was like this, now I'm not, there can be a lot of loss there. And I'm not saying don't think about that, because, we have to grieve the pieces of our identity that we feel disconnected from. But I think that, really having that self-compassion to understand that people change, and it is okay to change, and it is normal to change. The thing that's frustrating about loss is that it forces you to change in a way maybe you weren't ready for, or in a way you didn't want to. But you would have changed nonetheless, even if the loss hadn't happened. It just would have been more on your own terms, So change is the normal thing. We come full circle to where we started with this podcast. But yeah, I do think that self-compassion piece can be so good and so useful. And then just reminding yourself, you're not the same person necessarily, and that's okay. It's important to, like, grieve the things that are lost and that we miss, but also find different ways to kind of take steps and move forward.
Yeah, and the last thing I think I have on this, I don't know, I think this is the last thing I have on it, is just to say, with this specific question on journaling, but also for any number of other outlets that might be about really tapping into and expressing pieces of our grief, it's never too late. So I think there can be a feeling of, oh, if not now, is this my chance? That question at the end of, will I sort of regret it later? Am I in denial? If there comes a time down the road that you feel like, oh, wow, maybe I was really avoiding something, or now I feel like I want to do, it's never too late to come back and dig in and do journaling about your loss and revisiting some of the painful things, just like it is never too late to get a therapist or join a support group or find some other type of grief support. So I do think sometimes, especially when it comes to something like journaling, we feel like, oh, if I don't take this opportunity now to process my emotions around it, am I don't know, losing the chance to do that? Well, no, if later something bubbles up for you and you really feel like, oh, wow, this is here, and I do think it's going to be helpful to write about it, there's no expiration date. So you can always come back and explore it later.
Yeah. We have done podcasts and articles and things like that on what avoidance like is and is not in the past. And so if you're wondering about anything in your grief and wondering like, is this avoidance? Is this denial? We can link to some of those things. I think that it's interesting because avoidance is a really important thing to keep an eye on. So we're always wanting to talk about like how to know what it is and what it isn't, because a lot of times people can throw around the idea of avoidance and say you're avoiding, or you worry yourself that you are doing something pathological by not confronting a certain situation and things like that. And so we just want to kind of like normalize that just because you're not using a certain coping tool, just because you're not talking it out, just because you're not crying, just because you're not going to therapy, just because you're not going to a support group, that doesn't mean you're not grieving and coping. And it doesn't mean that you're in denial or that you're avoiding. There are so many ways to grieve and to cope that look maybe really outside of the box from what you expected grief and coping would look like. And so if you believe that you're, exploring your experiences, if you believe that you're allowing your emotions to exist and you're not kind of like caught in this cycle of running away from certain feelings, certain memories, certain ideas, certain thoughts, then, you're making the steps that you need to make. And I think that it's important to normalize. There are so many different ways to grieve and cope. But if you do feel like there are certain areas that you're really caught in this cycle of avoiding and it's taking up a lot of your thought, it's causing you a lot of anxiety, worrying about confronting those things, if it's preventing you from engaging in activities or, getting through your day-to-day, if it's cutting you off from people, then that there might be some avoidance in there that's getting to be, I won't even say unhealthy, but something that's in the way of you connecting with your life in the way that you would like to. And so that's when we would really say like, okay, let's take a step back. If this person had said, I really want to journal so badly, but I'm so worried if I do, I will have thoughts and emotions that are too hard to deal with, then we might say, well, the avoidance of those thoughts and emotions is cutting you off from something that you really care about. And so let's look at that.
Yeah, 100%.
So it can be complicated because we as humans naturally avoid things every day. Yeah. And a lot of the time it's okay. And in grief, we talk about taking time to avoid our grief a little bit so that we get a healthy break from it. Sometimes we talk about needing to avoid certain thoughts and emotions because we have to get through something else. We have to get through the day. We have to maybe get through services. We have to take care of somebody else in that moment. So there are times when we engage in avoidance and it's healthy. It's just that tipping point where it becomes either chronic or where it cuts us off from things we care about that we want to keep an eye on. So we can link to some other stuff if that's an area people want to delve into, because we talk about it a lot.
Yes, that will definitely be links included in the show notes.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us, and we will be back again very soon.